While coming and listening, I'm thinking just of the title of this conference exercise. I was thinking what exactly I should tell you that makes some sense. And to me, the idea of cultural diplomacy brings two concepts that I want to share with you. What are my thoughts and what are in fact, in many ways, Mexico's thoughts. We normally are in tune, but sometimes not so much. Cultural diplomacy means, on the one hand, one concept, the very obvious one, has to do with, well, the use of diplomacy, of culture as a means of diplomacy, the use of culture as a means of foreign policy, and indeed, most obviously, the sharing of culture for the sake of culture, which in itself is greatly important. And I will tell you on that first issue what is that reality, how we see it, and what are we trying to do. But then it also brings another concept that to me is not only a fascinating one, but a real current challenge for all of us, which is the need to adapt traditional diplomacy to very, very new challenges. And the fact that traditional diplomacy is falling short in terms of its ability to deal with these new realities, unless diplomacy becomes innovative, becomes more flexible, starts thinking out of the box, and understands how to grasp these new realities. So these are the two ideas that come to my head in thinking of cultural diplomacy. So on the cultural side, Mexico is indeed a very large country. It's a country of 120 million with an incredibly wealthy, rich history and background. And yes, Mexico is one of the, it is one of the largest cultural producers in the world precisely because of that, because we are a large country and we are the result of a very long, very complex evolution and mixture of realities, cultures, civilizations that came from the pre-Hispanic world, that it was a very advanced world, the Mayans, the Aztecs, etc., then the colonial years, and then what we are today. Particularly after the Mexican Revolution that finished in 1921, Mexican culture and the production of new thinking, post-revolutionary thinking, was as if it were put just in front of a fan aiming at Latin America. So this fan, after the Mexican Revolution, was turned on, and Mexican ideas, Mexican thinking, Mexican ideology, Mexican culture, Mexican cuisine, Mexican history, etc., began fanning southwards. The lesson of that for us, it's a very interesting one. And the lesson is that today, 100 years after this massive process of cultural sharing and movement after the Mexican Revolution, where we were building a new state after the revolution, etc., Mexico is still profiting from that. And the whole region is profiting from that. In what sense? In the sense that our ideas, our culture, our ways, our means, etc., became, and I don't want to sound presumptuous, mutatis mutandis, I'm careful with this, but it's a reality. they became the basis, the fundamentals for the rest of Latin America to follow their own path and growth, and the way their own societies were starting to develop. And for that, or because of that, the presence of the Mexican culture in the region and the like-mindedness and the connection, not governments, not official, not institutional, but the connection that there is there between peoples and the Mexican peoples is just absolutely remarkable and phenomenal. So in that sense is where I use the term, we are still profiting, and indeed we keep working there. Now, if we move now to the north, another very interesting phenomenon is occurring. Mexico, one of our characteristics, apart from size, these 120 million people, and we are a very large country from whatever angle you want to look at it, is that we are a country of multiple belongings, of multiple personalities. And not many countries in the world have this characteristic. And I can only find one or two more, which is the fact that Mexico is a Latin American country in Latin America, of course, that is geographically sat in North America, that has one of its sides to the Atlantic, the other to the Pacific, that we are a developing country, and in that sense very much you could say a southern country, but we are in the north, and we have been members of the OECD for 20 years. So it's a country of multiple realities, multiple faces, multiple facets at the same time, that has allowed us to develop and to operate in these multiple areas, being always more or less in the center, because we have genuine cultural affinities with the West, because Latin America is a Western region, but we also have genuine cultural affinities with other regions in the world. The North and the US. First interesting thing that you have to see is that we share a kilometer, a border with the United States of America that is 3,000 kilometers long. It's a border that should have some probably 20, 30 twin cities, which the difference between the two sides, the two sides of the city is just a border, but in fact is the same city. Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, Arizona, etc., etc., etc. Is a border that has more than 1.5 million human border crossings per day, meaning over 400 million human border crossings per year, both ways. No, it's not Mexicans jumping to the US. No, it's people moving both sides, tourists, business, food, dinner, friends, families that live in both sides of the border. And not to remind it with any kind of negative connotation, but it's a reality that all those southern parts of the US, California, Texas, Arizona, were Mexico one day, which means that they were grown and developed under the Mexican culture. So the first fascinating phenomenon that I wanted to share with you on this is the fact that all that region, the north part of Mexico, the border area, and the southern part of the US, the border area, have over the years been developing a third culture, if you like, which is the border culture, which across the border they are closer to each other than to the other side of their own country. And that also teaches so many lessons in terms of the strength of the power of human contact, and that's where I see where we see the real exchange of culture. Of course, we can do lots of things as we do, and I can tell you about more institutional exchanges, etc., with every part of the world. But these are phenomenally interesting cases of real culture not being exchanged, but it being jointly developed, jointly created by societies. That societies that, despite borders, that despite institutions, that despite laws, are together and they are developing their own way of life. On this same case of North America and the US and Mexico, the other interesting phenomenon is that Mexico has a diaspora. We use the term diaspora, probably is not the most appropriate, because diaspora normally means that is dispersed. But in the case of Mexico, our quote-unquote diaspora is focused in the US. And this diaspora is today more or less in the region of 32, 33 million people, which means that 10% of the US is either Mexican or Mexican origin or Mexican American. The impact of these 32, 33 million people, together of course with some 15 million more from other Spanish-speaking countries, is that it has been most to the dislike of Huntington, a real process and effect of impacting US culture with Mexican culture mainly. And one would say or would think that this obviously happens in California or in Texas. Of course, indeed. But if you go to the very north of the US, everywhere, nationwide, you will see a massive permeation, filtering through of Spanish and Mexican culture. What are we doing there? And I will stop this item of culture with these two comments. What are we doing there? We have, first of all, 51 consulates in the US, plus a very interesting institution in Mexico that was built 20 years ago, which is called Institute for Mexicans Abroad. In other words, Diaspora Institution. Together with our 50 consulates and this Diaspora Institution, IME, we are trying to foster Mexican culture there, not only through traditional cultural activities, which we do a lot nationwide and a lot worldwide, but because of the nature of this phenomenon in North America, very much addressed to Mexicans themselves, to foster their capacity to integrate, but also to remain Mexicans or maintain their Mexican background. There is a fantastic case. It's a very interesting case of cultural work, if I can put it this way, that you might find as interesting as we do. Now let me go quickly to the second issue, which has to do with these new challenges of diplomacy, and it comes to the case very well. It fits well here because the use of culture as diplomacy reflects already the need of adaptation and the need to be far more smarter in the way we do diplomacy. One of the challenges that we are facing today is, not only in diplomacy but in public life and in private life, is that reality tends to change much faster than mindsets. Reality changes faster than institutions. Reality changes faster than bureaucracies and laws and etc., etc. In the past, I think we normally were obviously behind trying to cope with the pace of change. But now, today, this change has taken light speed. It has become not only faster, but far more complex. And diplomacy in general terms is not being able to cope with that. It's not being able to cope with that because it's fast, and because, again, changing mindsets takes time. Because I was just reading an article wrote by a very dear friend of mine who used to be our ambassador in Washington, and he talking about more or less similar issues than this. He said, only babies like change, but other than babies, no one likes to change. And it's true. And institutions don't like to change. Bureaucracies don't like to change, and diplomats like myself don't like to change. Because we all feel safe in the comfort of status quo and static realities. But that is not true. Where are the changes? Because it's very easy to say we're just changing fast. Okay, but where, how, why? The first change that we are facing is that, unlike in the 18th century, 19th century diplomacy, early 20th century diplomacy, diplomacy was, first of all, predictable and rational. It was a chess game. You could predict what the other was going to do. Easy, no? Today, reality, the reality of the world has become the opposite, which is unpredictable. And sweeping events in an instant can change not only a big reality in a dramatic way, but destroyed in seconds strategies, plannings, models of doing things. So we need a great capacity to react, adapt, and operate. Another very interesting and very, very real change has to do with the actors doing diplomacy. In the good old days, as some would say, diplomats were the sole or almost the sole players in international affairs. International affairs were completely monopolized by governments, and in their interaction, there were governments doing diplomacy through diplomats. That keeps happening, except that the space of control, if you like, of realities that is under the hand of governments, diplomats in the traditional, more institutional way is shrinking. And it's shrinking rapidly. Why is shrinking? Well, because there are many other actors that are influencing global life seriously. Whether you want to call them companies, private sector, that have serious legitimate interests. No? So you have, for example, if you see statistics, one of the last I saw some time ago, it was like at least 50 or 60 global companies. Rather, if you mixed companies and countries in terms of economic capacity and you put in a list of 100, I think at least 60 companies made the list. 60 companies and 40 countries, something like that. It's really very impressive, and it's really very real. Civil society, NGOs, that are representing different kind of also legitimate interests to make sure that life, which today is global, is not anymore just local, goes in a certain way. And they have a real capacity to influence that, and to influence what countries can, cannot, should not do. Criminals, organized crime, terrorists, climate change, trade unions, mega individuals, as someone calls extremely wealthy, extremely powerful individual people that can influence decision-making processes everywhere, globally. And I'm not saying this as a way of criticize this reality, all the contrary. I think it is a fascinating one. I believe it's completely legitimate that in this more global and more democratic world, a more transparent world, where governments are also more accountable as it should be, there are many stakeholders interested, legitimately interested in public policy making, international policy making, and they have the means to do it, and it's correct. Now, what are the challenges posed because of that? Well, they're very serious challenges, meaning that we have to learn to do diplomacy in a plural way. And this notion of plurality or pluralism in diplomacy is still complex to grasp, because the change is complex and because mindsets take far more time than the reality to move. There is one third challenge as well, or new phenomenon that is forcing us to adapt quickly, which is technologies. Technologies are, not only we have this on predictability of events, we not only have all these new array of truly influential stakeholders worldwide, but we also have incredibly fast technologies, incredibly fast communication, and more importantly, today it is absolutely impossible to hide. Everything now happens in the open, real time, globally. So how do we cope with that as diplomats? That we were so comfortable writing our very, very elegant diplomatic note, notifying the host country that my government wishes to do that and wait for a reply, or meeting comfortably in the corridors of the UN, etc., deciding, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fair enough. We still do that. It's very important. But how we cope with events that are just overtaking us everywhere? Well, what we need to do is, first of all, of course, to be clear that diplomacy, foreign policy well designed, strategic, well thought, well planned, in ministries of foreign affairs, in capitals, remains paramount. Otherwise, no one can act. And we need to know what we want as countries, what is our place in the world, what are our global, national, regional interests, and how we are going to represent them. We need to know how are we going to use all this enormous array of tools, including culture, to portray or to represent our interests. We also need to understand something else, by the way, which is that today, unlike in the past probably, foreign policy and diplomacy can no longer be a zero-sum game in which is either your interest or mine, is your interest versus mine. And this can no longer happen, not because we are better people than we were before, not because we are more moral or more ethical than before. All that may be implicit in this. No, the reason is very simple, is that the so-called globalization and interdependence amongst countries is real, which means that for us to build our own prosperity, for us individual countries to solve our own problems, we need to help the others to do exactly the same. I want to create prosperity for Mexico. We want to create prosperity for Mexico. And we do understand that the only way that Mexico can create prosperity for itself is by creating prosperity for the others as well. Is this moral? Is this because we are nice? We are. But we also understand that there is no other way. How are we going to create prosperity for us at the expense of the other? Simply because it wouldn't work. We would fail in creating our own prosperity. And that very simple concept still needs to take stronger hold in diplomatic mentality and in foreign policy mentality. Once we have these very clear principles in our heads, as policymakers, as diplomats, then we entered a fascinating case of flexibility and capacity to react. In the more traditional diplomacy, we were used to operate always after we receive proper instructions, proper this, and say this, don't say that, accept this, don't accept that. Diplomatic cables go back and forth. But today, Twitter is faster. Events are known faster. So now we have to, I think, and that's what we are doing in Mexico at least, very seriously, very institutionally, very systematically, is how can we combine the policy-making design, strategic design of our foreign policy, together with the flexibility and the freedom to operate and to react that diplomats require on the ground. Because they will have to react in 3 seconds, and you cannot call I cannot call Mexico City to ask for instructions when I see a note or a news or a tweet or Facebook or whatever. So all these challenges are, or all these realities are creating very, very interesting challenges for diplomacy that need, as the world is changing and adapting so rapidly, we need to do it. It's not very easy. It means that we need to learn to be truly innovative, to really learn to think out of the box so we all can tackle these complex realities and we can do it in a proper way. And we can do that also understanding very well what are our country's interests. I think that we are obviously moving in the right direction. Obviously, this adaptation is taking place. But I insist, as I began, no one likes change. And the least of all are institutions. Institutions were not built to change themselves, at least not easily. It always happens the opposite. Whether it's institutions, companies, no, it's human nature. It happens this way. So we all have to be in public life incredibly smart in reading these new times, in adapting to them, in understanding the nature of uncertainty, in understanding the nature of a more global democratic environment with other stakeholders that have to have a legitimate right to be involved and to participate in public policy making, and they will make themselves heard quite correctly. So diplomacy today is not about talking government to government. Diplomacy today is about government to government, but governments to private sector, but governments to civil society to private sector, working together, all of us, to try to achieve bigger global goals. So I will leave it here. My message, I hope, is I hope you share it, because I truly believe that we need to move in this direction. And one last comment. The European Union, because at the end we are in Brussels and I was supposed to say something about the European Union too, Mexico, EU, is that one of the most complex, interesting realities between Mexico and European Union, has an enormous cultural content, is one. We are strategic partners. Mexico is one of the 12 strategic partners of the European Union for obvious reasons. No? It's a large country, etc., etc. But one of the main reasons, apart from our size, our global reach, our capacity, our influence, etc., is precisely culture. And it's culture in the sense that almost no other country in the world can be found of the nature size of Mexico that has the level of affinity, cultural affinity, with the European Union. And this cultural affinity, beyond cultural exchanges and things that we do, this real genuine cultural affinity allows us to be far more effective together in tackling precisely all the challenges I just mentioned. Well, thank you so much. And thanks so much again for the invitation.
Thank you very much for your attention.